Well, a good day to all of you who are tuning in, and a warm welcome. My name is Brian Finlay. I'm the president and CEO of the Stimson Center, Washington-based think tank that is honored to partner with the government of Japan on this Turtle Bay Roundtable series. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome you all to what is the 14th Turtle Bay seminar. For those of you that may be new to this series, it was pioneered by the Japanese mission to the United Nations, really as a service to the institution. It's a unique forum, I think, designed to really provide an opportunity for member states of the United Nations and others to really leave the talking points at the door and just engage in information gathering and network building around critical international security issues. And we really pride ourselves on offering up unique expert voices to you in the hopes that you will not just engage in open conversation here in this forum, but will also continue to rely on these individuals as resources well into the future. Just a few quick housekeeping items before we get started. I would note that this event is being live streamed and recorded and will be available for viewing after the event as well. It is also intended to be a conversation, and so I encourage you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen throughout the event, and my colleagues will queue up those questions for our speakers as well. And we will turn to audience questions toward the latter half of the program this morning. We really are eager to hear what's on your minds. We'll turn to that conversation just shortly, but first I wanted to introduce our host, Ambassador Ishikane. He is, of course, the permanent representative of Japan to the United Nations. He's had quite a remarkable career in the foreign ministry as Deputy Minister for Foreign Policy, as Director General within numerous bureaus across MOFA, from international cooperation to the Asia Bureau. But of course, Ambassador, most importantly, from my perspective, you also recently served as Ambassador to Canada before arriving in New York. Ambassador Ishikane, welcome, sir. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Brian. Yes, yes. Actually, I'm a former ambassador to Canada. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today. And it's, of course, my very pleasure to speak at this very beginning of the Turtle Bay seminar. And the Japanese mission to the United Nations has held this seminar together with the Stimson Center since 2011, including a previous session in March this year on outer space. And it is a part of Japan's long-standing effort to contribute to the UN community in New York and beyond, bringing fresh ideas and perspectives from the private sector into the diplomatic circle. So we appreciate the invaluable assistance that the Stimson Center has always, extended to us in this initiative. Well, today we will speak about the implications of 3D printing, a theme we briefly touched upon in seminar in 2018. 3D printing has the potential to be a revolutionary technology thanks to its unique features such as the diversity of its application. However, we must also be mindful of its potential use of malign purposes. The Secretary General's agenda for disarmament already mentioned its concern about this technology in the context of non-proliferation. Many discuss its implications for the proliferation of the WMD, the delivery means, as well as small arms and light weapons. So in this seminar, we are fortunate to welcome Ms. Izumi Nakamitsu and the Secretary General and High Representative for Disarmament Affairs. I am sure that this will be an excellent opportunity to deepen our understanding of the UN perspective of this critical issue with a focus on disarmament and non-proliferation. And it is also a great pleasure to be with a leading authority on the issue of 3D printing and international security, Dr. David Bray, a distinguished fellow at the Stimson Center and the Atlantic Council. I very much look forward to learning, among other things, how far we have come with 3D printing technology and how it may or may not impact the international environment. Through to the discussion of these distinguished speakers, I sincerely hope that this seminar will help us shed some light on how the UN can play a constructive role in the face of development of this critical technology. Thank you. Back to you, Brian.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for that intervention, and also just for your leadership as well in this series. It truly is a great public service to the United Nations, and we really are proud to be partnered with the mission on delivering that on Japan's behalf. Also, want to take a moment just to thank your staff as well, Ambassador Ishikani now. Shibuya, as well as Eric Stimson, who have really been instrumental in helping pull this event together and sustain it as well. Just again, as a reminder, ladies and gentlemen, we are accepting questions through the Q&A function on the bottom of your screens, and I encourage you to take advantage of that. So let's turn to the discussion. Back in 2013, a self-described crypto-anarchist and gun rights activist here in the United States posted blueprints for a functioning one-shot plastic pistol that could be reproduced with a 3D printer. The United States government fought a legal battle to have those plans taken down. It took time. They were ultimately successful, but not before the files for that gun had been downloaded over 100,000 times. Now, this anecdote to me is indicative of a wider challenge that 3D printing poses to international peace and security, even as the technology promises remarkable benefits to humanity. And I really do not want to lose sight of that latter statement at all as we move through this discussion. Today, we want to explore both of those angles, the positive as well as the potential consequences to security. And I do want to turn directly to the discussion now. And to help us do that, we have assembled quite a dynamic duo to help us walk through some of the issues relevant to the United Nations and concerning particularly technological advancements, specifically 3D printing. So first, needing no introduction, I think, to this community, let me say that Izumi Nakamitsu is a true overachiever in so many facets of her life, not least of which she has been pressed into service in this forum many more times than once. We're really deeply grateful to her enduring contribution and support of the Turtle Bay series. She is, of course, the Undersecretary General and High Representative for Disarmament Affairs in New York. I would exhaust myself in reciting to you her bio, but needless to say, she is ideally placed to help us to better understand, I think, the implications of advanced technologies on member states and on wider issues of international peace and security. She is joined by Dr. David Bray. I'm proud to say that David is a newly minted Distinguished Fellow at the Stimson Center. He comes to us following a long and distinguished career in and out of government service, private industry, and he is, to my mind, really the best of what the tech sector has to offer. As you are about to hear, not only is David an effective translator of complex technological principles to we lay people, he's also really deeply committed to finding ways to apply technology for good. The world really needs more David Brays out there. Thank you both for being here today. So let me just turn directly to questions, and David, maybe I could start with you just to sort of set the groundwork and get some of the basics under our belts. Let me ask you this: what is 3D printing, and is there a difference, David, between 3D printing and additive manufacturing? How long has it been around? How prevalent is it around the world today?
Sure. So 3D printing has been around since the 80s. We actually have our colleagues in Japan to thank for the innovations that made it possible. And it's come a long way. In the last 10 years, it used to be that to do 3D printing, you had to have an expensive printer, access to the materials, and they were slow. And while they are still nowhere at the price point or the speed that we want, they've come down dramatically. We're talking about a tenfold improvement. And so what you're seeing now in the world is, the good news is 3D printing is becoming democratized. The challenging news is 3D printing is becoming democratized. What does this mean for where do we want to go with it? In terms of additive manufacturing, so 3D printing, so some of the myths. you can't use every material for 3D printing. There's only certain select materials you can use for 3D printing. And so additive manufacturing includes 3D printing, but then adds it to more conventional manufacturing processes as well for those things that cannot be 3D printed. And I think that's really what we need to think about, is that the future is not that everything is going to have the magical Star Trek replicator that produces something on demand, but there's going to be cases where it's going to make more sense in terms of speed or in terms of cost or in terms of just having the customization that you want. It makes sense to 3D print some things and then have conventional manufacturing processes for other things. I'll give you an example. You probably have seen in the last few years, there's all the rage about 3D printed houses. Well, they're not fully 3D printed. 3D printing cannot print glass at the moment. So those glass windows actually had to be brought in through more conventional manufacturing processes and things like that. But there are cases where you can have the customization that you want, or you can have a decrease in the cost of materials, depending on the region, that's done with 3D printing. And you can do rapid prototyping. And so to set the scene, that really where we're at now is we're at the cusp of this future in which literally designs that can be created half a world away can be shared overseas, whether it's to replace something that broke, whether it's to customize something for a medical procedure or an agricultural procedure. It gives us interesting prototyping. You mentioned the example of what happened in 2013. It does raise interesting questions, though, for systems that were used to tracking things based on unique physical attributes. In this case, serial numbers on guns. How are we going to actually do this going forward? Because you may be able to replicate a gun and at the same time not have that serial number. I will share an interesting anecdote that maybe is the good side of this too. Of course, we had an unfortunate tragedy here in the United States recently where there was a discharge of a firearm on a shooting on a filming set. And it was actually pointed out that actually there already are cases in Hollywood where they actually use realistic guns that were actually 3D printed simply to have the realism, but they actually can't have firing mechanisms. And so this is actually a case where maybe lives could actually be saved by making realistic replicas that actually don't have the lethal effects that real things do. So like all things, technology itself, I always think it's how we use it that decides whether it's good or bad. And so really when we want to dive into the conversation today, it's really about what are the uses that will try to steer things more to benevolent ends as opposed to the alternatives.
Well, if I could just press you a little bit, David, on that. On the benevolent side, let's set the stage on that before we turn to some of the the challenges and the prospective downsides of the application of that. Give us a little bit more color on what you see as kind of the promise of 3D printing, and maybe what are some of the applications that might surprise people.
Sure. There's right now a growing movement. It actually is pretty big in Canada, and it's coming to the United States too, which is the right to repair movement. And I think 3D printing is going to tie into the right to repair movement. Not just, I mean, you just saw recently, Apple just made the decision that up until about a month ago, if you had cracked open your own iPhone or anything like that, you would have actually been voiding the warranty and in dereliction of what Apple said, which is you do not have the right to open up your own device. And they've changed that way. And so I think it's going to lead to an interesting future, not just for communications devices, but I'm thinking about one of the biggest challenges right now in, say, Africa or South America is if a part breaks on an agricultural piece of equipment, how are you going to get it? Especially now in the midst of COVID, where we know supply chains are already broken, can you really wait the 2 to 3 weeks of downtime for the part to get to you? But if instead you had local facilities where you could go to, almost like an auto mechanic shop, where they have the high grade material there, they have the different lithography, the different things necessary to print it, and you basically say, I want to get this part, and instead of having it be shipped from half a world away, which also would incur a carbon footprint, it's actually done right there. And so there's some green uses to this. It's on demand, it's much faster, and quite frankly, it can also create local jobs as opposed to jobs that are half a world away too. And so that is sort of the interesting possibilities of this. Now, to make that happen, we need more and more manufacturers to be willing to put their 3D images for the parts that they want to replace online. And that's a trade-off, because now you're giving up intellectual property, but you're doing it with the idea that actually people are going to use your products more. It creates an ecosystem of it more. And so I think really what we need to do is sort of take the wave that's already happening with the growing movement of right to repair. If I bought the device, I should be able to take it apart. I should be able to replace the parts. Have that movement sort of go into agriculture, but also think about like hospital equipment. I've seen already instances, and this happened to be in sub-Saharan Africa, where they can't afford a high-grade ventilator. But obviously with COVID, these things are needed. And so they really are using 3D printing to print some of the parts, not all the parts, but some of the parts to make them much cheaper than it would be if they tried to buy a high grade ventilator. And it's still just as effective. And so I look at both agriculture feeding the world as well as the health sector, especially in places that cannot afford what we in the United States currently pay for some of our medical equipment, as being the two early ones. I'd probably add a third one, which was kind of underneath on agriculture, which is potable water, and also having the ability to provide equipment and replace the parts for potable water generation anywhere in the world as well.
Well, one last stage setting question before I turn to you, Azumi. David, what is, give us the biggest myth that's out there that you see in terms of 3D printing as we lead into kind of a more in-depth discussion of some of the security implications.
Yeah, so I hinted a little bit, but I'll go a little bit. That one, 3D printing can't print everything. There's the myth that, I can do everything I want on it. It's like, no, it can't. But it can definitely do a lot of interesting things, and it is advancing at any given time. And so that leads to, I think there are some people that object to say, this is going to put me out of a job. And it's like, no, if anything, it's going to just change the nature of your job. So you're doing less rote and repetitive work, and you're able to do more creative work, more pioneering work. And so I think if I was to bust a myth, I would say, this is not going to put people out of work. It's not going to make it so that, again, we have the magical Star Trek replicator, but it is going to make it so that there are new jobs that are actually probably higher in value because they're not rote and repetitive anywhere in the world. And then the other thing is, even though while I say you can't print everything, you can't use all materials for 3D printing. What you can do, interestingly enough, is increasingly do organic materials. And so you can actually do 3D printing for, believe it or not, 3D printed food. And so that may actually become an interesting, maybe they'll eventually, maybe 5 years from now, I look forward to going with our Japanese colleagues. Maybe there's a restaurant where on demand, you ask what you want and it's actually printed for you and it's actually customized to what it looks like. But I raise that because, even though it sounds like a toy, I do look forward to an era in which, when we need to replace, maybe someone's bone has broken or something like that, maybe part of the 3D scaffolding is printed, customized to you, the person, and that's put on you. There's already examples, for example, when someone is growing and they, if they're a youngster and they're growing and maybe they have to replace every 3 or 4 months as they grow their kneecap or something like that, or a bone. This gives them to have the tailored abilities to replace this as they grow up. And so they can actually have it be part of the tailored replacements. And so I think the big myth with 3D printing is it's not going to replace everything. We're not going to have buildings that are built completely on demand, but it will be about tailoring it for interesting applications that allow us to then have what people actually do go further up the value chain.
Interesting. Astonishing. So, High Representative, with that in mind, I've said to you many times, and publicly and privately, that you have the most unenviable job at the United Nations. You're charged with ensuring that bad stuff does not happen. Not only do you have to manage the bad stuff that is happening, but you have to be looking over the horizon for bad things that could happen. And success only happens for you when nothing happens, which as I say, is not an enviable task. What is it about additive manufacturing that keeps you up at night? In other words, what's the biggest challenge in your view that it poses to international peace and security?
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Brian. And I really, more accurately, we try to make sure that bad things will not happen. Very often, it's very challenging, very difficult. But I wanted to actually thank you for, setting a stage with a positive use of these technologies as well. I often say that I'm a lady from a dark side. I have to, because of my job demands it, I have to talk about potential evils or wrong use of these wonderful technologies. But I think it's very important to really remember that those technologies actually has a huge potential in benefiting the humankind. So what we need to do is to try and prevent that these technologies will not be misused or malicious use has to be really controlled and managed. Now, additive manufacturing, from that point of view, can really contribute to the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and their means of delivery, missiles, and also to the illicit trade in small arms. And what's also important to remember is that the challenges will include the ways that complicate efforts to ensure international control. The potential proliferation uses are, I think, already increasing every year, even though, as I understand it, there are still remaining technical limitations, such as, of course, access to the relevant equipment, materials, and designs. And 3D printing of all, small arms and components really can pose many challenges. And it can hinder international tracing measures, when coupled with the use of a polymer-based and modular components. It can also facilitate decentralized production, if you will, in a way that complicate export controls and other regulations. And also production of small arms and components can occur at the level of even individual customers who can easily obtain designs in light of the difficulty of regulating intangible technology transfers. And I think also it's important to emphasize that additive manufacturing has lowered a technological threshold to build complex components, both for states, and I think we need to really emphasize non-state actors, including production equipment for fissile materials and chemical or biological weapons. And that's a real concern. And that kind of capabilities, help proliferation by reducing the risk of error, facilitating automated production, and through simulated prototyping, enabling the printing of previously really unprintable components. So those technologies are already used by some states to produce nuclear weapon related items, such as high explosive lenses in nuclear warheads. Now, also, commercial actors are already benefiting from 3D printing entire rocket engines, which really means that it could potentially ease, something related to missile components that can be produced in the future. So, these are just examples, but you can really see that if those technologies are used for malicious purposes, it could have quite a nightmarish consequences.
Well, I just note the tension, David. Thank you for that, High Representative. I note in your comments that the tension, right, that you and others are struggling with in terms of, we want this technology to be widely available, and yet we struggle with building the appropriate parameters around which to prevent some of the nightmare scenarios that you just alluded to. So, David, when security analysts get together, we sometimes lose perspective, right? That we forget that there are those significant upsides to this technology, and so I want to come back to that, but also from the technology perspective for you. So not putting on your private sector hat and speaking to UN member states. So what do you see as some of the cautionary notes about 3D printing? In other words, where should member states and the UN, in your view, be focusing their attention? And let me just stop there.
Well, I think what we're really hitting on is, such is the way of technology always. I would not have rolled back advances in industrial manufacturing, even though I recognize that also gave us mechanized tanks, but it also gave us good things. I would not roll back the advances that have occurred with computers, but it also allows us to now do simulations and things that can be then used to create nuclear materials. And so this is yet another challenge, which is we must adapt with it. And I think what makes it particularly challenging is the speed of adoption and democratization of this technology is no longer on the, it used to be a technology came out that was exquisite it was first used by nation states, and eventually maybe companies would adopt it and individuals adopt it. But that was a lead period of 25 to 30 years. And now we're seeing where, again, some new advance can occur with 3D printing that can then have the designs uploaded online. And you're talking about a matter of weeks or even days, as opposed to having the long lead time to respond. And so it points to, we've got to think about, as United Nations, we've got to think about as a society of nations around the world, how can we adapt and detect faster so that we are responding to our environment, which is a governance question as opposed to just a purely technological question. And it does point to industries in some respects are on the front line. Industry, I mean, what we did not talk about is industry is also concerned that 3D manufacturing and additive manufacturing will do counterfeit parts, which could be dangerous, not just to their bottom line, but if you buy a part thinking it was really a well-vetted part from this actual manufacturer, when in fact it isn't, and you use it and it breaks apart or it causes injury or loss of life, that could be a problem too. So there's a massive problem too of this will allow increasing counterfeiting, which could be both detrimental to businesses' economic line, but also hurt and injury to lives and others. So how do we get ahead of this? I'm going to toss out an idea that, at least on the, and I loved the remarks that were said, because I used to do bioterrorism preparedness and nobody would talk to me whenever I said I did bioterrorism preparedness, because the moment I said, what do you do? I do bioterrorism preparedness. They go the other way. And so I can relate to coming from the dark side and having to think about the unthinkable. I think we're going into a world in which relying on top-down, whether it be global or nation state, to be the only answer to this is insufficient. We're going to need almost like the sort of, if you see something, say something, raise it up. And I realize, that's not the only solution, but if communities are noticing there are now a flood of small arms that don't seem to be trackable that are showing up there, they probably need to then raise that to the appropriate individuals and say some investigation is necessary here. Someone is flooding the market. Something's going on here. Similarly, we need to think about ways of, maybe we can't trace who produced it or who printed the material, but can we actually have ways, whether it's with quantum dot material in the material itself that's used by the 3D printer, we can at least say it was sourced from here, it was sold from here, it was this batch that was sent to a certain people, so we can trace that. When it comes to guns, it may very well be thinking about, can we source, maybe it's not the actual weapon, but maybe it's actually the gunpowder that was actually used or something like that. Can we trace at least who it was sold to? And so, like all things, law enforcement, enforcement efforts, security efforts are going to have to adapt their techniques. And it's going to be challenging because the speed at which we're moving is different than the past. But I always like a good challenge. And so I think if we can at least try to have these good conversations, maybe it can help lead forward. And I do think thinking about how one involves industry, not only as colleagues who are also threatened by what this does, but also colleagues who, quite frankly, may produce entirely new lines of business that can help secure communities and societies to deal with this. That's something to be thinking about as we work and move forward together.
So I want to return to, I want to come back to that theme of, prospective partnerships with private industry that are win-win, right? That they're not asking industry to give up, but as you say, they could provide kind of win-win solutions. But maybe before we do that, High Representative, let me come back to you. This you alluded to, and I think David alluded to in the front end of that last intervention that he just made, that this is not the first time that we've been wrestling with this challenge. It's certainly not the first time that you have been wrestling, because in this forum, you have been talking about a long array of technological advances that are posing challenges, prospective challenges to your mission. So tell me, in your view, what makes this different from previous other technological breakthroughs?
Right. Well, I think concerns related to 3D printing has a lot in common with other types of emerging technologies of concern. Generally speaking, advanced conventional and unconventional weapons remain limited to technologically advanced states so far. But many emerging weapon technologies and their means of production are increasing, availability regardless of the state level of development. So David called it, it's democratized, and I think that's a very different, feature when it comes to those emerging technologies. And you can see similar patterns in cyber capabilities or, armed drones, and even high accuracy, long range missiles, etc. So that's one very important difference. These new weapon technologies are, often therefore readily available to non-state actors. That's a big concern to all of us. And another important feature, developments involving emerging weapon technologies are typically driven by, as we have already mentioned, by private sector for use in entirely legitimate and beneficial civilian purposes. So these are, technologies that bring a lot of goods, but, we need to look at the dark side, as we have been already talking about. Another important thing for the UN, UN and other multilateral disarmament processes are increasingly outpaced by the development of emerging technologies. And we can't deny that at all. And as the pace of technological developments is really challenging traditional arms control approaches, I think there is an emergence of a new approach on trying to regulate these thinkings. And that's not to regulate the technologies themselves, but we're increasingly focusing on norms of state behavior, what constitutes responsible state behavior, what is irresponsible state behavior, and what might be threatening behavior. And then we are now seeing these kinds of discussions really taking place, for example, in the areas of cyberspace and also starting in February, in 2 months' time in outer space discussions. But my final words on this question, one thing is very clear in my mind, and that is that these challenges ultimately serve to underscore the importance of improving international governance and cooperation. And as David also said, this is not a technology question, but it is a governance question. And because it is a governance question, international cooperation and multilateral cooperation, and by the way, it has to be multi-stakeholder engagement as well, that has to really improve, and we need to take a new approach in those discussions. That's a big difference.
So then, David, let's build on that and keep your private sector hat on for a moment. You're a hard-nosed private technologist who's looking to build markets around the world using this technology. Can you say a few words about how industry might be nudged by governments and others to nudge their activities from prospectively malign uses into more benign or even productive uses?
Right. So I loved what the High Representative said, that one, it's about what we're trying to do is encourage norms of behavior and shifting norms of behavior in the direction that we want. And I think that's appropriate because since this is an international activity and it's not just about governments talking to governments, but it's about industries that have different jurisdictions in which they operate. Let's think about, for example, a well-known company that was in social media by the name of Facebook, now Meta. What if they had very early on, like if we could go back in a time capsule 12 years ago, and they had created a way in which their user base, the people that were actually involved with the product, if they see something that they think is not a great use of their product or services, there's a way in which it's elevated and it's actually taken seriously. It's an ombuds function. It's a way of assigning alerts. I think it would have actually, would it have stopped everything? No, but it would have at least seen some of the, they did not intend for some of the bad uses of what their product ended up being used for. I think we should probably encourage that norms for nations to encourage norms of industry operating in them that happen to be involved with 3D printing and additive manufacturing is you have to have a way in which their tips can be elevated, and you are not just waiting for your customers to report they're seeing something bad, but you're actively scanning the market. You're looking for signals. That itself creates a whole new industry, which is the industry of due diligence on your part as a company to alert if someone is using, because I mean, I don't think any of the manufacturers of these printers are expecting them to be used in the negative purposes that they are. But at the same time, you can't say they're not responsible. They can't just dust their hands off and say, oh, we didn't build it for that purpose. So how they used it is not our responsibility. It's like you do have some culpability and responsibility. And maybe this is a part of extending the idea of ESG to include part of that is helping communities at the local level as well as at the national and international level watch for if your product is being used in ways that you don't expect it to be used. And I would extend that not just 3D printing and additive manufacturing, I'd extend that to just about any physical product in the world, any digital product in the world. Companies have to have increasing responsibility because things that used to be done by governments no longer solely can be done by governments just because of sheer speed. And if you are going to be a responsible private sector company, you need to at least have some mechanism both by which your support base can actively report if they see it's being used incorrectly, but you're also actively looking for signs and tells in the market. And we know, for example, I won't name any names, but we know, for example, pharmaceutical companies are very concerned in some countries that there are fake pharmaceuticals posing as them. Now, on the one hand, you might say they're not responsible because they didn't create the fake ones, but they know that if that fake pharmaceutical gets sold and it later is like company brand X caused these deaths, even though it wasn't their product, it's going to hurt them. It's going to hurt their bottom line. And so the last thing any company wants is our 3D printer was used for this atrocity that happened or whatever. And so you can also make the case that this is not just good citizenship. This is not just good corporate responsibility. This is actually good for your brand and your equity as a company to do the appropriate diligence. But that means, and again, that's why I use the word governance. It means that industry needs to start thinking of themselves as participants in international governance in ways that historically they haven't played before.
David, I forgot to mention at the top that this is an acronym-free zone. ESG. Explain that to our
environmental sustainability and governance. It's really the idea that ESG. Again, happy to, because we have way too many TLAs, three-letter acronyms. So ESG is this concept that as we go into a world in which companies impact their environment, which we know they do, then it's thinking about what is your activities that are around your environmental, your sustainability, and your governance activities to be good stewards of the planet. I would extend this as one step further. It's not just being about good stewards of the planet, but also about good stewards into the environment in which we operate as humans, as a species, alongside other species on the planet as well.
So, High Representative, in light of that and sort of the some of the, I think, really helpful and very specific ideas that David has generated, is it the UN's role to manage these threats or to help member states exploit the benefits? I mean, how do you manage this tension?
Well, I mean, our role hopefully will be both. I mean, in fact, the main job of the UN's disarmament bodies is really to manage threats and to do so in a manner that ensures all countries can still enjoy benefits of developments in technology. And as you know, the Secretary General publicizes every year a report of current developments in science and technology and their potential impact on international security and disarmament efforts. And we always emphasize that. Now, there's increasing recognition, more specifically about what could be UN's role. I think there is an increasing recognition that export regimes are struggling with challenges presented by new and emerging technologies. So the UN could have a role potentially to play in, broadening discussions on the further development and expansion of technology control regimes. And offer, universal platform where states can come and engage equally and have substantive discussions. And universal treaties like those governing, weapons of mass destruction, of course, also have a positive record, I would emphasize, in terms of providing assurances that non-proliferation measures can continue to be designed and really protected and implemented without having negative impacts on economic benefits of developing countries. So I think we need to actually, look at those examples and then think about, in different technology areas, how to, in fact, increase the benefits whilst at the same time, make sure that we don't have malicious use spreading out around the world. The next one I emphasize as a really important UN's role is really about, convening. Multi-stakeholder engagement is really critical, and a lot of discussions are happening now, but we need to make sure that those will be really properly fed into intergovernmental, government-to-government discussions as well. So, the Secretary General in his Common Agenda report, which he published in September, he really called for a move towards a new paradigm, if you will, of networked multilateralism, because it's no longer sufficient if governments just talking to themselves. We have to broaden the substantive discussions. So he intends to convene what he calls a Summit of the Future in 2023. And that will see high-level political agreement and also multi-stakeholder dialogue on the future of international governance in many of these areas. And then, technology issues featuring very strongly, very prominently in that as well. And as you know, Brian, already, that in his disarmament agenda, which was issued in 2018, he is already really emphasizing the importance of multi-stakeholder engagements. Specifically, he did say that he will engage and work with scientists, engineers, and industry to encourage responsible innovation of science and technology. Now, this actually is quite similar to what David is, talking about. I really loved his phrasing of industry of due diligence. I got a new business idea today at this seminar. We need to, as he says, we need to have those innovators, scientists, and engineers to already think about the potential vulnerabilities in their innovations. How that might be, in fact, misused. I mean, those thinking already integrated in the, during the phase of innovation, I think is quite important going forward. So we are especially engaging with younger people, to encourage and promote responsible innovation and application of innovations. I think this is really important. Yet another new approach to be integrated into arms control and disarmament discussions.
So let me press you. Also, a question from the audience, High Representative, just to drill down on that a little bit. Can you say a few words about how you are thinking, how the UN is thinking about action in two specific areas: small arms control and non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction? Right.
First one, small arms and light weapons. I think, it's actually encouraging that states continue to work in these areas, addressing concerns related to, in particular, 3D printing in the context of UN's, efforts to combat illicit trade in small arms. And just in terms of specific areas, I think it is very important that states continue to focus on technological developments, including metal printers, materials, also software, patents, and accessibility. Those are the areas they really need to deepen their discussions. They also have to look into the need for manufacturing controls. Of course, the immediate area, and this has already come up in our conversations today, the impact on marking, record keeping, and also tracing, really, direct and very practical implications of 3D printing. And of course, the challenges, broadening a little bit, but I think it's really critical, is the challenges related to law enforcement agencies. including, security screening and forensic techniques. I mean, those things also, as the technologies advance, those technologies also have to accompany in their developments as well. So those are some of the areas that we are encouraging states to really deepen their discussions. And then on the WMD, weapons of mass destruction side, in connection with, I mean, this area actually, there are, discussions taking place, especially in connection with the Security Council Resolution 1540. They have made broader efforts, I think, to address challenges posed by emerging technology. And then in particular, in 2016, there was a resolution, Security Council Resolution 2325, and the council committed to consider really rapid advances in science, technology, and international commerce, and call on states to strengthen their control over access to intangible transfer of technology and to proliferation sensitive information. So there is a good, starting point, a mandate actually is there, calling on all UN member states to act on this. And, little things that we are doing, UNODA, together with Germany, we co-hosted industrial outreach conference that was called Wiesbaden process since 2014. I think that was a small but important, outreach activity. And we have also sponsored research projects on how governments can better cooperate with industry, really key, on enforcing effective control over emerging technologies, and how, to advance, how advancing technologies can benefit government efforts to establish an effective strategic trade control system. We often talk about dark side. I think we need to talk more about how these technologies can be utilized for, weapons, disarmament efforts, verification efforts, but also, trade control systems as well. So I think it's that's a relatively unexplored area which we need to focus our interest and conversations further.
David, question from the audience that extends really that last builds upon that last point that the High Representative mentioned. Are there lessons to be learned from managing that risk-reward balance that you alluded to earlier with respect to 3D printing from the experiences with chemical and biological technology specifically?
Certainly, and I really liked the High Representative's remarks about ways we could move forward. So let me answer that question by also answering two other questions that I saw that came in the chat. There was first a question, which is, are all 3D printers the same? And that the individual asking the question had a sense that there's a great diversity. There is. There's a lot of great diversity in what 3D printers can do. And that gets to the other point, which is actually at least 2 of the COVID vaccines that are currently in the market were actually printed nucleotide by nucleotide. Now, we don't normally call that a 3D printer because it wasn't necessarily putting layers and using sort of lithography techniques. But in some respects, it was sort of a biological printer that actually allowed us to tailor design a COVID vaccine just because it happened to be an mRNA, molecular if you want me to do that, nucleic acid, the deacronization vaccine, which does get to the other question that was also asked, which is at some point, will the technology be built, will allow viruses to be built by 3D printing? Well, that's essentially what the mRNA vaccines are. It's a denaturized virus. It just happens to be one that tricks your body into mounting an immune response that later will be effective when the COVID virus itself presents itself to you. But yes, that is something that's already on the horizon, which is we already are seeing these things being used for good, which is in this case producing therapeutics and vaccines. But it may also point to a future in which someone actually does print. And I wouldn't call that 3D printing, that's more biological printing, but we should make sure our responses include them in the envelope of not only what we do for 3D printing, but what we do for biological printing too. Which then gets to your question about, can we draw any lessons from what's been done in biological and chemical for this regime? And as I was listening to the High Representative's remarks, in some respects, again, it's a double-edged sword, which is while this creates new challenges for dealing with WMDs, it does raise interesting questions, which is in the past for counterproliferation, it was expensive to introduce global sensors that would detect activities that might be associated with the refinement of fissile material and things like that. But now it's getting increasingly inexpensive for local communities to have these running in the background. If they pick something that is indicative of fissile material passing through or things like that, you could technically have a global alert network that still protects privacy, still respects individual freedom of access and things like that, but it could actually alert the local community, alert the nation at the same time, alert the UN that we've seen something. And that could actually be not just for countering concerns of WMD, but countering concerns of a future pathogen too. It could actually, we know, for example, monitoring wastewater is a good way to actually detect the spread of COVID. I'm not saying you're going to see fissile material in the wastewater. If you did, something's wrong. But you could be monitoring different sources. And it could also inform climate change, because we do not currently have an open access way of monitoring climate change around the world as well, which in some respects actually makes it harder for people to act, because in some cases, in some communities, they're not seeing the impacts of climate change yet. It's half a world away to them, and so they're not motivated. And so if the UN thought of a broader effort that literally almost took what was said by the Secretary General in terms of networked governance, let's actually think about actually having a series of interoperable networks that are monitoring for signs of things that are biological, things that are WMD related, but also climate change related, and make that open source data. So now you have a longitudinal data set of what's going on around the world. Make sure it's still preserving human rights, it's still preserving individual privacy, so it's not identified to an individual. That's something that one, industry could help the UN build. And then two, it gets us ready for this new era where I think we have to go, where to be able to adapt and move at the speed necessary, we've got to have a faster way of observing how our environment's changing.
David, just another question that came in related to the technology itself, and it's topical as we're all struggling right now with supply chain issues, everything from cars to you name it. And I wonder if you could say just a couple of quick words on what 3D printing could mean geopolitically in terms of disruption of supply chains and manufacturing, or providing benefits that would help us avoid these sorts of challenges in the future.
Well, I think the good news is, so I think when people look back 10 to 20 years from now, they'll say that the late 20th century and the first decade of the 21st century was all focusing on just-in-time supply chains. It was all about efficiency. It was about, having, shipping something half a world away, incurring a massive carbon footprint at the same time. And you didn't want to have excess inventory because that was wasted space and everything like that. Well, then a pandemic happened and other things happened too, concerns about the climate. And so if I would hope maybe 10 to 20 years from now, when history is written, that this was an awakening moment to us, that just-in-time supply chains are brittle and they're also massively not green in their carbon footprint. And so we use 3D printing, we use additive manufacturing, one, to have less brittle supply chains and to actually be able to have things on demand as localities need them, but then two, to reduce the carbon footprint. Now, that's going to impact the economies of some nations that right now are used to providing the global supply chain half a world away. And in fact, they may feel a little threatened by that. I won't name any names of the countries, but they may feel a little threatened. And so we're going to have this as being an ongoing dialogue, multi-stakeholder. This is the role of the United Nations to help ease that transition. But as much as 3D printing produces some interesting challenges, I think at the end of the day, the net balance is on the good side. If we can manage the fact that humans sometimes use technologies for bad purposes, if we can manage that, it will actually, probably the only way we can achieve at least half, if not all, of the UN sustainability, the sustainable development goals, we're going to have 3D printing and additive manufacturing be a part of it. And it's also going to reduce carbon footprints. It's going to make us more adaptable as a planet and less brittle. And so if I could actually think of, maybe a long-term goal for the United Nations for that 2023 summit, let's think about some demonstration projects we can get both world governments and industry players to commit to that start to solve the UN SDGs using 3D printing and additive manufacturing, while also showing a way of earlier alerts if these technologies are being used for less than benevolent purposes.
And then let me go back to a point that you alluded to and ask you, and then the High Representative to comment. A question from Jonathan Brewer, who asks whether or not, as you look out from a technology perspective, David, do you see the possibility that that this technology can help kind of facilitate the production of new and innovative viruses? And then, pending that answer, High Representative, what do we do in that environment, David?
It's already here. I would say, like unfortunately, do-it-yourself bio has been here for a while. Do-it-yourself nucleotide printing is still prohibitively expensive for the average individual, but like all things, in 5 years, it'll be available to the individual. Now, in some respects, that's going to be great, because the good news is personalized medicine's coming. We can tailor therapeutics to just you. We can have novel therapies. But the bad news is personalized medicine's coming, which is also personalized poison. And so this is why I think I really respect the work that the High Representative is doing, because it is at the end of the day shifting how we do security, how we do governance, to deal with not just 3D printing, but synthetic biology and other threats as well. And I would point to one interesting example of hope. There is a company called Ginkgo Bioworks, which actually gave their employees, their scientists, 10x voting rights relative to the other shareholders. And the idea is that these scientists are seeing how the technologies are being developed and are on the front line. And if they object to something being developed because they're concerned about it being used for less than benevolent purposes, they can essentially override the board. And I think that's an interesting small example of a company embracing this idea of corporate due diligence at Ginkgo Bioworks. It's something to think about as a model for what we want to think about with 3D printing. But it is recognizing that, again, the average person in the public will not have the time to go deep in these subjects. But that's why we have the professions. You have a professional society of doctors that sort of self-regulate the medical profession, a professional society of lawyers that self-regulate lawyers. Do we need to have a professional society that regulates this, that says, you take a pledge of ethics to be a good scientist. And part of that is if you have concerns about something that might be designed and be weaponized in ways that you don't want to have it happen, you not only need to raise your voice, but here's a mechanism you can raise it to your community, to the nation, to the UN. And here's a mechanism in which industry is held accountable for thinking about how things are rolled out. Even if they, again, we're not going to be able to predict every third or fourth order effect of how something is designed. But what we can do is manage how we respond and detect it and deal with it when that actually happens.
So, High Representative, I want to give you a chance to weigh in not just on that issue, but also ask you an exit question. And David, I will pose it to you also as we're nearing here the top of the hour. Curious to know your reactions as I say, High Representative, to that comment by David. But also, if there is one message, and I ask this at the end of every one of these sessions, if there is one message that we hope that the member states that are tuning into this discussion will carry back to Capitol, what is that message? What do you hope will be transmitted back?
Well, thank you. I'm really truly fascinated by the potential of these technologies, and I think we need to make sure that this fascination, the real sort of a potential that we could have for the future generations to be really kept alive, and then we have to put our heads together to manage the dark side of it, the potential misuse of it. We do have some important opportunities coming up. There is a review conference of a biological weapons convention that is taking place next year. And I could see that there are real momentum. I mean, the states are generally speaking, really understanding that we have to take this as an important opportunity and make sure that there is a revitalized BWC, after the review conference. What I really want to emphasize at the end is that, so much of them are really new, and we are going through a massive paradigm shift in many different areas. This means that business as usual, the traditional way of arms control, disarmament discussions just would not be sufficient. We need to make sure that we will, take advantage of new approaches, innovative, thinkings, creative ways of looking at those issues and have a really different kinds of a mechanism to, to regulate and control and manage potential threats. Some of that will probably include identifying, red line, big no-no. And I think it's also happening. I mean, in the areas of lethal autonomous weapon system, the AI-enabled weapon systems, the fully autonomous weapons, I think there is a convergence at the international community that the fully autonomous weapons really should not be deployed or developed. They are now engaged in exactly how to make sure that will happen. But I think we need to, look at what will be, definitely no. And then the rest, we need to take a new innovative thinkings and then really focus on, responsible behaviors, of states and individuals. And then through a much more active multi-stakeholder type of engagements, deepen the substance. So this will be a big, really difficult endeavor ahead of us. And that's what we need to, try and make it happen in the future summit in 2023.
Thank you. David, 15 seconds. What should headline my memo back to Capital?
Back to Capital is it's here. We need to adapt. We need to find ways to bring industry and government together. I just want to build on one last thought to think about too. So a few days ago, the announcement was made that we now have robots that can actually replicate themselves using organic material. In some respects, that's kind of 3D printing. It's not exactly 3D printing. It's not lithography, but who's going to make sure that the robots that can make replications of themselves don't get out of hand? What could possibly go wrong? But at the same time, it's also an interesting opportunity, which is if we actually design robots that can replicate themselves, could they actually be part of a monitoring convention to make sure we're not seeing fissile material being used in ways that it shouldn't be? So like all things, it's the human choices that will determine whether the future is benevolent or not. It's the speed at which things are happening that is dramatically different than a decade before. And so I look forward to continuing the conversations both at Stinson with the United Nations. We've got to think about how we accelerate our involvement of different stakeholders in governance in such a way that is relevant for the challenges ahead.
Dr. Bray, High Representative, so grateful to both of you. Thank you for making the time to do this, and to all of our all of those that tuned in as well. I want to give the final word, however, to my colleague from the Japanese mission up in New York, Naohisa Shibuya. Now, I believe you are out there, sir. He is having technical challenges. So I will, on his behalf and on behalf of Ambassador Ishikane, thank once again both of you for making the time here today. As I mentioned, this will be available, and we will circulate the video widely. It will be available on the Stimson website, as well as on the site of the Japanese mission to the UN. Thank you all very much once again for tuning in, and I hope you have a very good day.